Welcome to D&I One-on-One. This is a bi-weekly webinar series where we talk about a lot of different topics, diversity and inclusion related, but one topic and one conversation at a time. My name is Jina Etienne. I'm creator and host of the series. I'm a certified diversity executive, and I center my work on something called fearless inclusion, which is the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create the space for others to do the same. And I develop trainings and workshops to help facilitate the work around fostering inclusivity and culture of belongingness in organizations through training and consulting, et cetera, et cetera. I shifted to this work almost 10 years ago. I'm actually a CPA, and I had about a 20-something year career in public accounting before shifting to this work. Joining me today is Kimberly Stephan Tate. She's the owner of Tate of Mind Consulting. Her work is rooted in helping historically excluded people reach their full potential. She's a career coach who helps women, people of color, and LGBTQ+ people with their resumes, LinkedIn, and their job search strategies. She also works with many organizations on their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Lastly, she helps organizations remove bias in their hiring practices. So, she does just a few things. Fun fact, Kimberly was on Oprah's very last Favorite Things show, very last one ever. I have so many questions, but that's a different session. She was raised in Boston, lived most of her adult life in Nashville, and today she lives in Maui with her wife, 3 dogs, and 2 cats. And let me just start, Kimberly, by saying, and for everyone to know, I reached out to you and said, I'll give you a pass. I'll scramble. I'll find another guest because of the tragedy in Maui. And, gratefully, you said, no, I'll continue to do this and stay with you. So thank you for that. And I hope everything's going well.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So everyone, well, before we jump into this conversation, I want to launch our very first polling question, which is, how familiar are you with ERGs? And while this poll is open, Kimberly, I'm going to want to go back to our first conversation about this as soon as the poll closes. When you said something about organizations positioning ERGs as a tool to build retention in an organization and keep them happy, you talked about how companies should consider using them as a quote unquote diversity lens, which I thought was really cool. So I want you to, if you can touch on that. And then after the poll results, maybe we start with the definition.
Sure. Well, the first thing is, I think there's a lot of misperceptions around what employee resource groups are in the first place.
Well, hold on. Don't give the answer away.
Sorry.
You're gonna cheat and give them the answer before they finish. Now I can see the poll is almost closed. It's almost done. And it's an interesting mix so far.
All right, closing down poll question number 1. I'm going to share the results with you on screen here. And there you go, Jina.
Yeah, 10%. I don't know if you can see this, Kimberly. 10% are very familiar. And of the rest, it's like a third. Somewhat not very familiar, or this is all new to me. And so, yeah, I think starting off with the definition, because I don't know about you, but I get so frustrated when somebody uses an acronym and I have no idea what it means.
So employee resource groups were in response to, we know there's a lot of people that have historically been excluded. So when you think about employee resource groups, they generally target women, people of color, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities. There's lots of different groups you could have. Certainly, we now see today other groups that are new and emerging, like young professional, experienced professional. But really, there's 5 true pillars of work that employee resource groups tend to work on. They're not cupcakes and balloons at all, right? This is really a way to harness your workforce to push your business forward. And so the first thing that employee resource groups tend to focus on is community involvement and community partnerships. So how do we just give back where we work and live, right? Secondly, it's about professional development. We know that women tend to get paid less than men. People of color get paid less than people who are not. So how do we give them the right development they need to help them succeed? The third one is engagement. The more engaged you are, to your point earlier, the less likely you are to leave the company, right? And
Mhm.
then it's really all about business innovation. How do you make sure you have different thought leaders coming together to make recommendations to your product group? For example, are we going to create this app in Spanish? Is it going to be a bilingual app? Is it going to be accessible to people who have difficulty with seeing or hearing? And then lastly, really taking a lens at influencing policy and procedure at your organization. So let's say LGBTQ community. You can tell me all day long that you're an inclusive organization, but if you don't have gender identity, gender expression, and those types of things in your EEOC statement, I'm not sure I believe you. If you don't have a policy for inclusivity around the LGBTQ community, I'm not sure I believe you, right? So those are really sort of the 5 things that employee resource groups tend to focus on.
So it's interesting. You talked about 5 things, but too often it seems to me that employee resource groups only in the largest of companies might do the help us think about new ways to nuance our product or different markets that we can start to try to approach or penetrate. But too often then that leaves other organizations making it just a place where all the people of ... And so we're actually clustering people into groups, and some may see that almost as divisive. And so what can we focus on the piece for now to start with around what do they do? Why do we group these people together? And is there a core benefit to just that piece of it, that we can get all the women together, that we can get everybody who's part of the LGBTQ community together? And then is it only for them or can anybody join?
So I could talk about this alone for just an hour, but I'll keep it simple. Employee resource groups started back in approximately the 1960s. So I'm going to go back for just a second and talk about DEI in general for just a second. When most people hear DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, a lot of people, especially people of the baby boomer generation, tend to think of affirmative action, which is now there's this quota and we have to have a certain percentage of representation.
Anti-discrimination, right.
Exactly. And so in the 1960s, Xerox came out and said, you know what? We think that we should be a better company than just meeting the bare minimum of having the right level of representation. We see that there's riots. We see that there's racism. We have employees that are Black. How do we start to solve for that and help them and make them feel included? And so Xerox is the very first company ever attributed with creating an employee resource group with the intention of how do we provide extra support to this group of people who have a different set of lived experiences that sometimes can hurt them in the workplace, right? And so
sorry, remind me again, I don't mean to interrupt. Remind me what was the time frame of this? 70s, 80s, 90s?
It started in the 60s.
Xerox's employee resource group started in the 60s?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Now the formalization took some time, but 1964, it was in response to some race riots that were happening. Of course, they were the first ones, and so over time it became like a really formal thing, and it became the model for others to follow, right? But yes, it's definitely there. In fact, other really progressive companies like AT&T, their employee resource groups started back in the 80s. So it's definitely something that's been in the works for a really long time. They generally are focused on historically excluded groups of people. But I think I'll give you a great example, because you said, you know, is this really just for people of that group, or is it for around? So I want to talk a little bit about in the midst of COVID, when the world realized that racism was alive and well in 2020. I'm not sure how people didn't realize it, but somehow a lot of people just were like, wait, this is still happening today in the wake of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And so this is where a lot of employee resource groups and DEI teams had to come together and go, like, we really need to be thoughtful about this. And so, for example, one organization that I work with said, okay, we need to give people of color and Black people, African Americans, we need to give them a space that is sacred, that is just for them and doesn't involve anybody else. And so they set up these leadership meetings where people would come together and nobody else was invited. But conversely, they had groups of allyship meetings where they said, hey, if you don't understand this, if you want to learn more, come to this. And so I think that ERGs are best when we embrace intersectionality and we're super intentional of this event is for everyone. This event is for this subgroup of people. This event is for allies. And because that way you're really being thoughtful about what do people need the most.
So now we only have 14 other things we need to talk about.
Exactly.
So what I want to do in the order that you brought them up, I'm going to pop us over here to this allyship slide because you talk about allies. You just talk about being allies. Can you define, I know it's on the screen, but your own words, can you define allyship and why does it matter?
So I can sum it up in one word. Allyship is action. So it's not enough just to be like, hey, I'm not a racist, right? That's not allyship. Allyship is I support the community, whether that's I support small Black-owned businesses, I buy from LGBTQ businesses, I have allyship training at my company, I attend that allyship training at my company, I'm proactively learning more about racism, and maybe I was shielded from that. So how do I start to understand how that really plays into someone's lived experience, learning about microaggressions. And so it really is about taking action because we don't know what we don't know. And so it's
Right.
peeling back those layers of what am I not actually aware of that I need to educate myself on that will help me be a better manager, a people leader, a peer, and really just a steward in the world.
Yeah, and I like to position allyship as you engaging in a group that you're not a member of that community. So it's a way for me to signal to people in that group, I support you, as well as I would like mentorship from you. So while it's important for me to understand some of these broader issues, which hopefully your organization might provide training on, so unconscious bias, microaggressions, actual allyship training, bystander training, like all these different types of training, but there's still the opportunity through the employee resource group that you and I connect one-to-one, right? And through the group, I can do that. I might not otherwise meet you.
Right. And here's actually another great example, and that is if you happen to be a Caucasian male, like you need to be in the women's networking group events, whatever women's networking group you have, you need to be attending those kinds of events, because here's what we know for sure is that we hear the stat all the time that women make 80 cents on the dollar. That's white women. White women make 80 cents on the dollar. Black women, African American women, they tend to make 60 cents on the dollar roughly, and then Latina women make about 40 cents on the dollar. And we know that where women and people of color start to hurt in their career and not get the upward trajectory they deserve as at the manager level. And so you see a really significant drop off at manager, it drops off again at director, drops off even more when you get to senior level. And so having men in these groups and listening to these conversations is critically important, because they need to understand why this is happening. It's not because the woman's not as talented. It's not because she's not as educated. In fact, Black women are more educated than anyone else in the country. So why would they make so much less? And it's teaching leaders, especially homogenous leaders, this is what you don't know, and this is what you've got to do different for succession planning, professional development, hiring practices, in order to make sure that you have equitable processes.
So to recap then, allyship is a two-way street. Allyship is me engaging with groups that are different than the group I belong to, so I can learn from them, learn about them, and better understand their lived experience. It's also for them to bring their expertise and resources to me. I mean, well, I said it's a two-way street. So as an ally, it's not just I benefit, but the other group benefits as well.
That's exactly right.
And here's the other term you threw out there, intersectionality. And you even alluded to it just now in your other comment, because the idea of intersectionality is that all of us are made up of a bunch of different dimensions of diversity. And the way they intersect for you and the way they intersect for me aren't the same. So as women, we might share some things in common. I'm Black. Looks to me like you're not. You're LGBTQ. I don't even know the right term. What are you comfortable with? Lesbian? Gay? So,
I'm
because, you know,
either lesbian or I'm gay, either one, interchangeable.
and I'm heterosexual cisgender. So there are differences here. And there were also areas where we cross over in identity. And so you mentioned as a man in a woman's networking and in a woman's employee resource group, that is a piece where he can not only understand the gender piece, but some of these other dimensions of diversity as it relates to gender. That makes sense. So intersectionality, then it shows up. If I have a employee resource group for African Americans, an employee resource group for millennials, an employee resource group for parents, if they're all sliced that thinly, intersectionality means there's no one place for me. Do I go to all of them? Like, how does this show up?
I think you go where you feel the most comfortable and what resonates for you, right? So the first thing, because there's a lot to unpack here. So the first thing is we all have a different lived experience, right? And we all have these different lenses or dimensions to who we are. So for example, you might look at me, if I did not tell you, if I had not come out of the closet and said I'm a lesbian, if you just looked at me, you might think like, what does this chick know about diversity, equity, inclusion? She's white, she's female, she's blonde. What does she know, right? But what you can't see about my diversity is that I am a lesbian, unless I tell you, you don't know that. I struggle with dyslexia and I have a lot of anxiety, which means that I'm neurodivergent, right? And you may not know that I grew up in Boston, moved to Nashville, now I live on Maui. All those things inform who I am and the experience that I have. And why that's important is, while I have had some disadvantage being a lesbian, I certainly have the privilege of being white, right? Conversely, if you're talking about somebody in the LGBTQ community who is a Black transgender female, she's going to have a completely different experience because now she's dealing with being transgender. She's part of the community, plus she's a Black woman, right? And so that really does play a big part, because if I grow up in Dahlonega, Georgia, then I probably have a very different experience than if I grew up in San Francisco. So all these things inform who we eventually become. And then from an intersectionality perspective, what we're always encouraging employee resource groups to think about is, while you might have an umbrella that you're serving, remember there's subsets of people inside that umbrella. A women's group is another great example. While your focus is on women, some of those women are early in their career. Some of those women are, they're experienced adults. Some of them have kids. Some of them do not. Some of them may be veterans. Some of them may be people of color. And so I think you go where you feel like you belong the most, what resonates the most with you. But if you're an employee resource group leader, you really want to think about, how do I cast a wide net to make sure I'm serving my community in the very best way that I possibly can.
I'm looking at this what is an ERG slide. And the first bullet talks about it you just said an overarching, I don't remember the word that followed that. So we have individual groups and there's an overarching plan or expectation around employee resource groups. And so here there's some language that talks about promoting equal employment opportunities. And yet we know that this isn't just about anti-discrimination and equal employment. So if you think about it from an intersectionality lens, I have individual groups, I have an overarching thing, but really I'm looking at it in equal opportunity, which sounds like it's narrowing us right back down to protected groups. I feel like, don't ask me why, but the image that's just popped into my head is a Rubik's Cube. Because it feels like there is a lot of moving parts, a lot of different directions. And there's a person who made a comment in here. I've been trying to read it because it's long, but I would boil this down to, great, but what about the white guys? Are we inadvertently excluding white heterosexual men? And this comes up a lot in D&I work generally, but there's not a group here. They're not reflected here.
So certainly when you embrace allyship, white homogenous men are more than welcome to come to any group at all. Part of the reason that there's not necessarily a white male ERG is that there are certain privileges associated with being a white male, right? And that doesn't mean, I want to make this clear, because that does not mean because you're a white male that your life wasn't hard. It doesn't mean you did not have difficult life experiences. It doesn't mean that you didn't put yourself through college. It doesn't mean that you didn't grow up poor, right? But it just means innately being born a white male, you have more access to manager plus positions than women and people of color do. And so that is why a lot of the work is focused on women and people of color, because it takes so much more to get them where they want to go in their careers, even if they are equally educated, even if they are equally experienced. White men just get more callbacks than women or people of color.
Okay. Well, before we go any further, let's go ahead and launch our second polling question. What percentage of Fortune 500 companies have employee resource groups? I think it's interesting to think about employee resource groups from the beginning, when I talked about it as really big companies like the Fortune 500, and then really small organizations, maybe 200 people. And that, going back to our title, Empowering Diversity through employee resource groups, is there a benefit to having a number of different employee resource groups when you have a smaller organization? So I'm curious, don't give the answer away yet until the poll is closing, but it's one thing to expect employee resource groups in a very big company. I feel like I'd be surprised if they didn't have them.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it help us in a smaller organization? I'd love to touch on that if we could.
Absolutely.
All right, Jina, we've just closed poll question number 2, and let me share the results on screen here. So what percentage of Fortune 500 companies have ERGs? We have 47% of attendees saying less than half, 20% said 60%, 10% of attendees said 90%, 15% of attendees said 75%, and 8% of attendees said prefer not to answer. Back to you.
Don't you love multiple choice questions where there's percentages so that you can say which percentage said which percent? But so what's the answer, Kimberly?
So obviously this can fluctuate because businesses are constantly opening and closing. But generally speaking, we see that more than 60% of companies have employee resource groups. And to sort of get into what you were asking about smaller organizations, I would say, first of all, regardless of how large your company is, if you're thinking about starting an employee resource group, it is always better to start small, right? To sort of create some sort of grassroots effort. Now, if you have a 10-person team and that's your entire organization, then employee resource groups may not make sense. You probably want to have at least 100 or so employees. And then what you can do is a little bit of a poll and just sort of see, like, do you have interest in starting employee resource groups? And if you do, which ones might be interesting to you, to sort of get a gauge. What I've seen other companies do as they're starting to grow and they're considering employee resource groups is anybody can sort of try to establish an employee resource group with some criteria. You have to be at a certain level of the organization. But you need to go get 10 signatures from people that say, like, I'm willing to sign up for that group. So I would say, like, if you can find 10 people in your organization that want to do the thing that you're talking about, then I think you're good. If you can't, then I think there's some ways that you can be creative, innovative to bring some of these concepts to your office without having like an actual formal employee resource group.
There's a client that I have that's pretty small, and they were thinking about employee resource groups. And what's interesting is the approach that I took is, and because they have fewer than 100 people, perhaps what we do is we have a group or a network of employees that are interested in learning more about different groups. And so it's more like a group focused on education and awareness, and then they can go either by quarter or by some scheduled sequence, a focus on these different groups. And it could be that they have programming that follows the Heritage Months, but Heritage Months don't cover all groups. And the groups that matter might be different in different organizations. But that was one approach, so that for this quarter, when we're all getting together, for example, we're focusing on issues for parents.
Mhm.
This next quarter, when we start meeting and having resources and education, we're focusing on issues for veterans,
Mhm.
that kind of thing, or people who are caretakers. There are a lot of other groupings besides race, gender, disability, veteran status, age, and we're starting to see more and more of those. You started to do this, so I actually want to jump over here. Let's say our organization is big enough and we say, we want to do this thing. Let's start off with a few. There's a process. You just talked about gauging interest and executive buy-in. When executive buy-in, did you mean when you said get 10 signatures, did you mean the number one, employee interest? Or did you mean number two, I need 10 leaders to say, I will support this?
More just 10 total employees. I mean, you definitely want leadership support. If you don't have the support of your leadership, that's going to be challenging and you're going to be driving an uphill battle. But really, it's more like, could I find 10 people who want to go do this thing that I want to go do? Right?
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
there's a comment that came into the chat that I'd like to address because I think it's really important.
Absolutely.
So somebody said, I really appreciate your sentiment, but all of this division makes me sad. And I get it, right? At the end of the day, I would it would be a beautiful thing if we all just got along. And one of the things that I hear a lot, I've heard people say things like, well, I just don't see color, right? So part of the reason for the employee groups is to teach people what they don't know. And I love to tell them myself, so I'm gonna tell a story, okay? And I hope you can go there with me. So
Okay.
I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work for 2 decades. But my real work started with LGBTQ advocacy. So I sat down one day with a friend of mine. She happens to be a Black female, and we were chatting, we worked together. And I said some sort of offhanded comment about, you and I have so much in common. Like we both have sort of the same discrimination, right? And so she looked at me, God bless her, but she looked at me and she said, Kim, you don't know anything about being Black. Like, I get what you're trying to say. I get you're saying there's a golden thread that you've been discriminated against being lesbian. I've been discriminated against about being Black. She's like, but here's the thing. One, you don't know anything about systemic racism. And two, you shouldn't have to do this, but if you wanted to, if you felt unsafe, you could mask. You could just not come out of the closet. Whereas with me, I'm Black every single day and I can't take that off. And I was like, I just was like, and I was like, oh my God, Zuri, first of all, I'm terribly sorry that I offended you in this moment. And I, backpedaled. I was like, let me apologize. But it was a really major lesson for me. And so I don't think that these groups, if done correctly, they're not really meant to divide us. They're really meant to unite us. How do I teach you how we're more alike than we're not? And then the ways in which we're different, how do I educate you so that you understand my community of people better and differently so that you can be a better ally to me, right?
Right. It's interesting because I think a lot of this work can be seen as divisive, as opposed to about creating awareness. And I will piggyback on that the group we all know, because they're the most represented in leadership, certainly in C-suite leadership, are white men. And that's not because for any reason, then it's just there's a lot of them and therefore the norms are there. They have the jobs, they have the positions, and to a large degree, we sort of all take it for granted. But what we don't notice is the lack of representation. We don't, and so having these conversations almost brings into our awareness that the fact that, wow, there's not really diverse, or we get somebody into this role, first woman ever, and really appreciating the challenges, what it took for her to get there, what she's up against being there, what some of the things she can do to be an ally to other women, and just looking at it through the slice of the women's view. So I think a lot of this work, and that's where ERGs can be helpful when you talk about empowering diversity. It's two ways, and we've talked about this. The ERG can help raise awareness, build networking, create professional development opportunities. It's a place for me to go get coaching from somebody who looks like me or from somebody who might share my background and experience and identity.
Mhm.
as well as providing education to the rest of the organization about here's what our lived experience looks like. So I think that that's an important piece to think about.
And just to add on to that, one thing that I think is really important is if you do get involved in an employee resource group, if you have the opportunity, let me tell you a couple of the skills that you're going to learn. One of them is how to influence without authority. And that is a huge skill to have in your day job. It is the ability to influence. That's going to help you no matter what job you have, no matter what function you're in, no matter what your title is. And then it's also really going to help you manage conflict. Because that's what this is these ERG leaders are trying to influence business leaders in the business. And sometimes business leaders are there for it and they're like, yes, what you said. And other times they're like, no, we're not ready for that. That's big and scary. I don't know if we want to make a public statement about that. I don't know if we want to, I don't want to be like super political, but like just as an example, when Roe v. Wade got overturned, Salesforce had been preparing for months in case it happened. And the day that it came out, they immediately started publishing things and said, we stand with women at salesforce.com. And we are immediately instituting a policy that if you should need some reproductive health care, we will help you and a partner, significant other, friend, go to the safest state, take care of your travel, and make sure that you have what you need.
You're talking about internally.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that they made that policy internally, but then they did a whole campaign letting people know women can come work at Salesforce.
Oh, got it.
Right? But like that, can you imagine the conversations that had to happen with the company on like, this is a divisive topic. Do we really want to make a stand on this? But this is a lot of times where employee resource groups can be really powerful and say like, if we don't say something, what message are we giving to the women that work at our company? Right?
I wanted to put this slide up here because if you look at this and all of the different things that employee resource groups do, on the bottom right, it says resource group, period. So they serve as a resource to the organization for all things. And in this case, understanding the issues, understanding the impact, understanding the messaging. What is a way to express this, to talk about this, and you can fill in the blank on whatever this is, from the perspective of somebody who's lived that experience. So having a group around that helps ensure that it is a collective voice rather than Jina's opinion.
Exactly.
Because if we go tap one person on the shoulder of a particular dimension of diversity or with a particular difference, we're really not getting a diverse perspective. We're getting one person's perspective who happens to be ... The other thing here that you talked about is constituency groups. That's up here as well. And the fact that employee resource groups can serve as advocates for the organization, advocates for the employees within the resource group. There are just so many different dimensions of what employee resource groups can do. And too commonly, I think I'd said this at the beginning, it's often just seen as an affinity network. So everybody from XYZ difference gets together and has education on what it means to be a person of an XYZ difference. And it's so much more than that.
So let me give you an example. One of the companies that I work with, I started an LGBTQ employee resource group. And like that first year, I did sort of like National Coming Out Day, and I gave my coming out story. And I was like, okay, share your coming out story. And like literally there was crickets, nobody said anything, right? And of course I was new in this process too. So I was like, well, okay, why might that be? And so as a team, we came together and said, you know what, here's what we have to do. The proof is in the pudding. It is in the action, right? And so we set a big, hairy goal of getting 100% on HRC, the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. It's a 100-point scale. It looks at your training, your representation, your ERGs, all of that, your benefits. And we said, okay, the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go and figure out where we're at today. We're just gonna baseline. And then the second thing we're gonna do is figure out like other things that we still need to do, how big, how hairy, how expensive. And what we were able to do over the course of 3 years was go from a 60 to 100. And basically we changed our EOC statement, we developed allyship training, we changed our handbook, we did all these things. And so then once people started seeing the action, then we started having managers come out, directors come out, senior directors come out, but they needed to know they were safe And that if they did come out and someone were to try to retaliate, that the company was going to have their back. And so that's where yes, it can be like, it's engaging, it's fun, we're doing a professional network, but it really can change the culture of your organization over time and your business innovation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is a perfect pause to go to our third polling question. Does your organization have employee resource groups? And it's going to be interesting. I don't think we asked, and in hindsight, maybe we could have asked, like, what's the size? How big is your company? Like right before we asked this question. And then I can see there are a lot of questions in the queue, so I do want to come back. Somebody asked about the statistic around Black women being the most educated population. Is there a resource you can point them to? And if not, what I would tell this person is email me and or Kimberly. Our contact information is there, and we can follow up with you directly on that statistic.
Absolutely. And one site that I will tell you that I use tremendously is leanin.org. It's Sheryl Sandberg's nonprofit. There is a tremendous amount of information on there about women of color. I mean, the stats are incredible. So that is definitely a really, really, really great site to go check out. One of the things that I saw before we released the poll or talk about the poll, I just wanted to address what I saw in the chat was somebody said, hey, how do we increase our allyship when we're doing events? How do we get people to show up? I think it's really important when you're doing event planning that you think about, like, what is it you want to get out of the event? Like, what's the point? And that you are really intentional about sharing with people what they're going to get out of the event, right? So this event is for members and allies, or, hey,
that's important to say so that everybody knows they can come. Actually.
That's exactly right. Or, hey, this event is only for allies, and here's what we're going to teach you. Here's what you're going to leave with today, right? I also think, like, you have to be super intentional. Sometimes, and I hate to say this, but even in 2023, sometimes people don't want to sign up for like the LGBT group because they're like, well, I don't want people to think I'm gay, which that's a problem in and of itself, right? But
I mean, that's a true statement, and that's each group has their nuances and complexities, and that's a very real challenge for members of the community. But sorry, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole.
No, so I just think you have to think about it, right? Like maybe you do something where you have an ally spotlight, and you're like, oh, this is our ally, Susie, and here's why she's here, because her son is gay. Or, and then again, just making it really clear in all of your messaging every single time, this group is for these people and their allies.
Right, right. A lot of us need to know psychological safety is a culture where people can ask questions, push back, make statements, raise their hand and openly disagree, and it's still safe. They don't get attacked, marginalized, shamed, judged, etc. And without that, people aren't going to raise their hand and engage, to your point. Now, we actually have quite a bit of time left, but I wanted to just see if we couldn't hit some of these questions. And then if we hit them all, we can come back to discussion. Is that okay with you?
I would love that. And there's one that I see that I would love to address, if that's okay. Okay.
Yeah, which one? So I can see.
So there's a question here about, like, what is discrimination? Like, is the actual behavior manifested by prejudice? Tell me more about that. So one of the things we talk a lot about is intent versus impact, okay? So there are things called microaggressions. It's a slight, it's something that you say that's offensive to somebody. It's a gesture you make that could be offensive to somebody, whether you meant to do it or not, right? So let's say, for example, you happen to be Caucasian and you are looking at someone who happens to be a Black female and you love her hair and you reach out and touch her hair. Like, well, in what universe is it actually appropriate for you to touch a stranger's hair, right? That's considered a microaggression. Or if you looked at me and I had not formally introduced myself and told you anything, but you see I'm wearing a wedding ring, and you say, oh, you're married. What's your husband's name? What does your husband do for a living, right? So sometimes what happens in corporate America or in life is a very specific, like a true discrimination of, I hate LGBTQ people and I think they're all going straight to, where. But more times than often, what we're really trying to educate on is these are some subtleties. These are some things that people in this community have experienced that you may not know you've been doing, right? There's phrases we've used that are super outdated that we shouldn't be using. And so it really is educating yourself on what are common microaggressions that happen to these different communities, eradicating those from your vocabulary, right? Or the way that you show up, the way that you talk to people. And then if you do make a mistake, being genuinely apologetic.
I would add to that real quickly, and then we can go to another question. I would add to that when we think about discrimination, the other thing we're thinking about is systems, policies, and practices that, unbeknownst to us, are inequitable in that they create barriers, usually unintended barriers, to members of marginalized, disadvantaged, or minority groups. And so discrimination ends up happening inadvertently.
So,
all right, let's.
Oh, sorry, there's a stat on that. So let me give you one stat.
Sure.
Again, I could spend a whole hour talking about hiring and where companies get this wrong. This is a Harvard Business Review article. So if you find this interesting, you literally could just type in Harvard Business Review if you only have 2 women in your final pool of candidates. But there's a Harvard Business Review study that was done that says if you only have 1 woman in your final slate of candidates, statistically, she has no chance of getting hired.
Yes,
0.
that is a fascinating article because it talks about the more people you have as a percentage, how their opportunity to get a job skyrockets.
Yes.
Simply because of the representation in the candidate pool.
That is exactly right. And the same stat is true if you only have 1 person of color. But if you have 2 women in your final slate of candidates, and by final slate, in case you don't know what I mean like, okay, here's my final 5 candidates, and I'm going to hire one of these 5 people. If you have 2 women, their chances of one of them getting hired goes up by 79%. And then if you have 2 people of color, the chances of one of them getting hired goes up by 194%. It's insane. And so it really is all of this bias. And when you think about bias, I'll give you an example, another example. Women go through this assertive versus likable bias, and it's a double-edged sword. It's sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. So if you're super, super likable, then the feedback that women get on their evaluations is, well, you're a great team player, but I don't see you as a leader. But then if they go over here and they're like, well, I'm assertive, they get feedback that they're aggressive, they're a B. And there's actually studies on this. Women were asked, how often have you been given the feedback that you're too assertive? And women are given this feedback 67% of the time. But when men are asked, how many times have you ever been told in your career evaluations that you are assertive or, a little too much or too bold? 1% of the time. So it really is understanding the bias that is influencing our careers.
There's a webinar that I did. I'm going to go with March because I believe that's when I did it. And so for those of you, it's on CPA Academy. So the archive in theory is there. I don't know, but it was called the confidence gap, or building confidence in agency or something like that. And one of the things I spoke to specifically is how women, we kind of internalize some of that. And as a result, it shows up in when we raise our hand for a job, when we ask for promotion, when we evaluate our own performance against some of these measures. That's part of what feeds into these statistics. So in case anybody's interested, all right, now we have 4 minutes, give or take, maybe 8 if we're being generous. How can ERGs better promote their events to allies? The invites might say all are welcome, but oftentimes I hear that allies aren't sure if they should go to an event or not. So even if you say all are welcome, is there some additional messaging you can put in there to reinforce it? Because otherwise, maybe everybody join us is so generic that it doesn't land the way intended.
Yeah, I think first of all, being intentional about your programming and what are you going to offer to everyone versus what are you going to offer to just allies or just to the people that identify as part of that ERG. I think really making sure all of your communication says and allies. I know that it seems simple, but just every communication going out with, women and allies or people of color and allies, so people know that they are welcome. And then I also say invite a friend. If you're, if you're going to the event, grab somebody and just be like, come with me to this event. I want you to check this out with me. I think you'll be surprised at what we might learn today.
What do you think about the idea of putting a takeaway for a member of the group, takeaway for an ally? So what will I get as an ally coming to the meeting?
Absolutely. I definitely think you should do a takeaway. And then I think you should get creative and see see what works, like see what people come to, right? Like you might try a book club. Maybe you do a book club that has sort of like a, either like a theme on racism, a theme on women in the workplace, LGBT, whatever. There's a million things you could do. Veterans, you could do something like that. You could do a movie, like where you watch a movie, like watch something like Crash and then discuss it afterward and talk about all the different pieces that go into it. You can have some sort of allyship training. There's a lot you can do there to sort of, hey, ally, here's what you're going to get out of this session today and how you're going to leave the session better for the time that we spent together.
There's a comment in here. So I'm going to read the whole thing and then I want to make a comment on it. We're just putting people in buckets now. Seems divisive and like we're going in the wrong direction. Just my 2 cents. I would also like her to back up her stats with data. The X dollars on the dollar for women. I think that's what she's saying. She would qualify that this is not across the same jobs. So I want to address that in saying that we aren't trying to put people in buckets. What we're trying to do is help people see the buckets and become aware of the buckets, because people are organized naturally in groups, but a lot of those groups remain invisible. So by raising awareness of women, by raising awareness of people who are in the LGBTQ community, or raising awareness and understanding of different abilities, isn't to be divisive, but to be inclusive. It's quite the opposite. And then as far as the statistics, those statistics that you're citing on dollars that women make compared to men are general statistics. They're publicly available. I'd encourage people to research them because they will be different in different industries. I mean, there are many industries where women make the same, if not more than men. But this is just an overarching statistic, so there's a higher likelihood than not that this might exist generically in a company. So I just wanted to touch on that.
And I will also say that this data has been sliced and diced a million different ways. There's information that you can easily go look up from the US Department of Labor, and it slices and dices it depending on what your education is. There's information functionally, what group you're in, or like whether you're in finance, whether you're in marketing, the industries. And again, Lean In has a lot of information, Department of Labor has a lot of information, but there's definitely tons of research on this, and oftentimes you can actually get super granular and look at like for like to see that even like for like there's inequity.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wish we had a ton of time. We are sort of at the end. I'm going to do two quick. This is the self-promotion piece. Because this is a bi-week webinar series. 2 weeks from now, Adriana Flax is going to be joining me. And you actually talked about this a little bit of some of those visible differences. She's going to talk specifically about differences that you can see literally on somebody's face, because she's going to be talking about it from the perspective of somebody who has quite a noticeable birthmark, and then what that tells all of us in terms of how we navigate differences when they aren't the kinds of differences we're used to. I do have a schedule all the way built out through early October, and so October 20th, I'm working on a guest for that one, so please save the date. Next Tuesday, I'm doing a webinar on neurodiversity, and I was posting on LinkedIn that this one is personal for me. I have ADHD, diagnosed as an adult, and I'm still learning how it manifests itself in my life and better understanding the strategies that I've developed to compensate for it. But as it turns out, maybe it's a superpower. And so I would encourage people to join that session. I'm not only talking about ADHD, but from my own personal experience. And so as we wrap up, and before we go to, well, actually, you know what? Christine, why don't we open that last poll? And while the poll is open, maybe Kimberly, you have what, 1 minute for a final words. Any final closing thoughts?
What I will tell you is I'm constantly posting about diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts. I'm constantly posting on job search strategy, your resume, LinkedIn, interview questions, your career. And so I'd love if you would go find me on LinkedIn and follow me. I put my name again in the chat, so it's Kimberly Stephan Tate. So feel free to find me, follow me on LinkedIn if you want to get some tips and tricks around your career and around diversity, equity, inclusion. But I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you for your open mind. I know some of the concepts we talked about are different. I know it's hard to think about how we can be all alike, but then be different. And so I really appreciate everyone's open mind to the conversation today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad you could join us. There's so many things that we can talk about. And that's why this series is so important, because if you pick any single subject, there's an opportunity to do a deeper dive, because there's nuances and complexities, and and everything falls into the classic answer to any accounting question. It depends. Now, just a quick reminder, everybody, on the bottom of the slide, the bio slide, you see here Kimberly's contact information. You can even just go to the website and get all of your contact information if you didn't catch her on LinkedIn. And so, Christine, with that, I think we'll toss it back to you to close us out.